So I thought we might start today with a little time travel, back to the turn of the century. Can you remember where that was? The year 2000. I don't know what you were doing or where you were in the year 2000, but I know exactly where I was, smack dab midlife. No longer young, not quite old. Now, that's a problem. No younger, young, not quite old. Because you don't really know where you are in this whole business of life and what comes next. And I'm thinking about this, and I'm looking at this, and I'm wondering, what is it that we might want to do at this point that would move things along and move them forward? Now, I'm 50 years old at that point. I've been married for 25 years. I've got kids who are spreading their wings and flying away. I've got a business that's humming along. I've got a freshly minted master's degree hanging on the wall. And you might think that I had all kinds of reasons to be celebratory. But in fact, I would say that at that time, there were a lot of days for me that were somewhat gray and dull and colorless. Not that black cloud of depression or deep anxiety hanging over my head, but more like an annoying fog rolling in. A fog that was coloring my vision, clouding my vision, and making it a little bit difficult to feel excited about the day. And I was wondering where I would go with this and what kinds of things might happen as I tried to move forward through this fog. I didn't really have a word to describe it then, but I certainly do now, looking back, and I would describe it as malaise, midlife malaise. Now, that sounds a little bit, I know, like the kind of thing that you might hear discussed in hush-hush tones on a late-night infomercial. She's got the malaise. You know, I hope it's not contagious. And in fact, there is an element of contagion around malaise. There's a dis-ease and uneasiness. You're not quite sure why. You're feeling uninspired. And although life is good in that qualified kind of way, it does not exactly seem great. Now, I don't know where you are in your journey from the cradle to the grave, but somewhere along this midpoint, you too will start asking yourself questions about how life is going. And you'll get some answers there that may or may not surprise you. It's not unusual for people to feel a bit of a dip in satisfaction and a dip in happiness at that point of midlife, somewhere in their 40s and in their 50s. It's not all related to the fact that we put on an extra 5, 10, 15, 20 pounds, or that gravity has gifted us with a few more sags and bags and wrinkles along the way. There's other things at play, and in particular, there is the force of unmet expectations. What we hoped life might be by now, partnered with, on the other hand, the very heavy weight of our daily obligations. And there we are, smack dab in the middle, trying to deal with this. Now, these expectations didn't just come out of thin air. Really, we've been working on them for some time. And if I take you back to your childhood, I'm pretty sure every single one of you will remember being called to answer this question. So what exactly do you want to be when you grow up? I remember thinking taller, but that's really not an acceptable kind of answer. But we all come up with our own answers, and as we move into our teens and into our 20s, what happens is that we start to flesh this out. So by the time we launch into life, we have these aspirations and ambitions that are in front of us. And then a few decades later, we find ourselves looking at this and taking stock. And a few decades later, the question changes. The question changes from this, what do you want to be when you grow up, to how do you want to be as you grow old? Lots of different ways to answer that question as well. And I've noticed how people deal with and struggle with this fog of malaise and this question of how now and what next at that point in their lives. And there are at least 3 different ways that people respond to this. The first way looks like this: resignation. Resignation waves that white flag of surrender, whispers things in your ear like, well, you're 40, 50, 60. What do you expect? That's just the way things are, really. So suck it up, settle down, right? And maybe you know people who have been resigned. If not physically, at least mentally. They've checked right out. I ran into a fellow by the name of Charlie not too long ago and asked him how things were going. And Charlie very pointedly looked at his watch, he checked the date, and proceeded to tell me that he was exactly 5 years, 4 months, 3 weeks, and 2 days away from retirement. Now, clearly, Charlie's a flag-bearing member of the Resignation team. And, we don't know what's going to happen with Charlie. We know he has a plan. His plan is actually to coast to the end and then drag himself across the finish line. And Charlie looked pretty miserable that day. I'm pretty sure that he spread miserable everywhere he went. So that's one option. One option is really resignation. The other option is detonation. Detonation runs around with a hand grenade, going, pull the pin, pull the pin. Detonation says things like, see that grass over there? Way greener than where you are. Way greener. No dandelions. Mows itself. Come on. Jump the fence. You know you want to. Pull the pin. And we see people who detonate things. They blow up relationships at midlife. They blow up their careers. They do a total lifestyle makeover. And this is not to say that sometimes this isn't appropriate, because sometimes there are good reasons to do that. But the problem with this is that there's often a lot of collateral damage, and we blow up the good things at the same time. So back in 2000, I'm looking at this for me, and I'm thinking, okay, resignation, really, no future in that. Detonation? Way too many good things in my life to even consider that. So if not one of those two, then what? If I'm not prepared to be giving up or getting out, what is my other option? And the third option, I think, is one of getting through. The third option relates to exploration. And exploring is a tricky kind of thing, too, because exploring will not be hurried. Exploring will not be rushed. You can't say, I'm going to have this figured out by 2 weeks from Tuesday and be good to go. And if you are the kind of person, and maybe even from your earlier life, who like to set a goal and go for it, please know that at midlife, there's so many things in play here that it's more like a mucking around in the swamp or a wandering around in the wilderness, trying to find your way through. Now, that's not to say that there isn't a process that can take you through this, because there is, and it's one that you're all familiar with. If you've ever lit a fire anywhere in your life, that's really what we're talking about. We're talking about trying to kindle a flame for what comes next in life. And you need some fuel. You need to strike a match. And you need, of course, to fan the flames. So how does this play out? When you're trying to find some fuel, what you're looking around for is kindling at midlife. So what's got potential? What's got possibilities? And the challenge with all of these things going on around us, with the noise and commotion around us, is to tune into that inside voice, an inside voice that speaks in very quiet whispers and nudges and tugs and twinges, that's often very difficult to hear. I'm not talking about trying to find your big overarching super purpose, capital P-U-R-P-O-S-E, because if you've ever tried to do that, you'll know that it's hard, it's difficult, it feels really heavy. And especially if you're not in particularly great shape while you're looking at this, it's even more difficult. What I am talking about is tuning into that voice and looking for what is it that you are curious about. What is it that is intriguing to you? What is it that might be calling you? And in order to do this, you really need to engage in reflection, and you really need to engage in noticing, paying attention. Now, back when I was looking at this for myself around the year 2000, I started to look at what were some of the highlights in my life, what are some of the lowlights, what are some of the themes, the threads along the way. I started looking at what lifted my energy, what drained my energy away, just sucked it right out of me, and I started looking around for what I was missing. And what I gathered by way of fuel was this, that I was really missing novelty and variety. I was also missing the whole experience of creative expression in some new and unfamiliar way, and the learning that goes with that. I don't know what you'll find when you'll look, but it could be all over the place. Just gather up whatever seems to show some potential or promise for you, and when you have something that is really appealing to you, you'll know that it's time to strike a match. For me, when I looked at the whole business of creative expression, I could see a whole thread of breadcrumbs along the way. I used to love, as a kid, doing paint by numbers. I loved learning how to sew. I loved doing arts and crafts. I loved doing flower arranging. I loved learning how to spin with my grandmother's spinning wheel and dye yarn and weave and do landscape gardening, all those kinds of things around me. And so I thought, with that kind of background and history, clearly I must have some kind of interest in design or the arts, and certainly something with color. And so when I stumbled across an ad for a painting class, never having taken an art class in my life, I struck a match, I wrote a check, I went for it. At the end of that 5-day watercolor workshop, I had a new set of supplies. I had an inkling of how difficult this was going to be, and I had a set of really, really, really bad paintings. But I was hooked. That fire lit, that fire caught, and I wanted to find out more. Now, I don't know if your fire will strike and light first time out, or if you make a fire and it'll fizzle. You make a fire and it'll fizzle. How that's going to work for you. But keep at it. And as soon as something catches fire, what you want to do is to fan the flames. You want to move some oxygen that way. You want to move some fuel, some energy, some resources that way. Now, know without a doubt that at a point at which you start to do that, the voices, the chorus will arise. Maybe in the back of your head, maybe out loud, maybe the committee on your shoulder. It's going to say things like, "You suck at this. Really, you're never going to be any good at this. You're busy already. What do you think you're trying to do, trying to make time for this? And this is going to cost you money. You don't have money for doing anything like this." And whatever you do, don't give in to those voices. Don't give in. You know, experience tells me this, but research also tells me this. Some of you maybe have heard of the research by Bonnie Ware, who was a palliative care nurse in Australia, and she asked people at the end of their lives what they had regrets about. This was the number one regret. "I wished I'd had the courage to live a life that was true to myself and not the life that others expected of me." That, expectations, that's those voices over here. Don't pay attention to them, let them go. Let them find someone else to bother about this. Go ahead and fan the flames of whatever it is that has potential for you and move it forward. Sometimes you have to let other things go too. When I started to get more involved in painting, I had to let go some of my volunteering activities, and I stopped doing as much gardening, and I turned my writing corner at home in my office into a painting studio. And then I started taking things like my paints and my sketchbooks with me everywhere I went, on business trips and on family trips as well. And I started looking around going, okay, whose work do I admire? Who could I study with? And I ended up going to workshops wherever I could find them. Went from the Cotswolds in England to Sedona, Arizona, to Bend, Oregon, to Toronto, Ontario, studying with people. Signed on to do a 2-week trip to Europe to painting straight for 2 weeks straight. Awesome, excited, energizing. And at this point, painting started to elbow for more room in my life. So I started to look for ways to build it into the business. And I started giving some of my paintings away as thank you gifts to clients. I started including my images in the newsletters that I was writing every week. I started showing my work in different places. I started set up a website to sell that work online. And then I really screwed up my courage and collected a number of sketches that I had done around town here and put together this book, Sketches of Saskatoon. That was a big reach. That was a big stretch for me. And what surprised me the most was how well received that was. So that was what fanning the flames looked like for me. I don't know what it will look like for you. But I do know this, that in that road, along the road of exploration, that there are things that you will learn. I learned, for instance, that when you can increase your excitement and enthusiasm in one arena of your life, that it's likely it will spill over and increase your contentment in other areas as well. I learned that if your tank is full, if you're excited about what's going on in your world, that what will happen is you'll be way more supportive of the interests and pursuits of other people around you. And I also learned that as soon as you step out on that path of exploration, you really have no idea what kinds of doors are going to open along the way. I had no idea when I signed on for that 5-day painting workshop so many years ago that that path would lead me here, to be on this stage with you, talking to you about midlife malaise. The other thing I know about this is that I am not alone in this, and neither are you if you end up facing this in your world and in your life. There are many, many people who are trying to find their own way through. For example, we have Dave, who is dealing with some of the doldrums of midlife in a career in public service, who reached outside to pursue his interests in food and technology. He created a website where he answers people's food and cooking questions. That website has now had over 3 million visitors. And the revenue from that website pays for his technology toys. We have Jane, who is experiencing some midlife malaise, in part because of the loss of someone who was very close to her. And she reached back to remember when she'd been a child on the farm as a 12-year-old girl and how excited she was to find a stone tool in the field. That caused her to step forward and join the local archaeological society. And she has now been on field trips to many places that she never, ever would have been or seen before. And that spark of adventure reminded her that life indeed could well be good again. And then we have Joe, kind of like Charlie, coasting to the end, retirement in sight, until one of the leaders in his organization stepped away from a team that he had been in charge of for some time. Joe had always been interested in this particular team, and so he had an opportunity now to step forward and to put some ideas forward as to where that might go in the future. Joe tells me that he has gone from putting in time to now being concerned that he will not have enough time to put in. So the good news in all of this, the good news for you and everyone else around us, is that it doesn't matter what age or page or stage of life you happen to be on. There are always more things that you could do, try, and be. And know, too, that if malaise has not yet knocked on your door, it's coming. And when it comes, don't resist it, don't ignore it, welcome it into your life, and let it be a catalyst that helps you light a spark for what comes next for you. Thank you very much.